"Get out. Security. Escort this man out now." Derek, the loan manager, ordered loudly. The tension cut through the air as David, the black CEO, slowly reached up to his face. The security guards advanced, hands ready at their belts. "I've simply requested to speak with a manager about my loan application," David explained to Thomas calmly. "I have not raised my voice or been confrontational in any way. We don't give loans out to frauds and people like you. You're only causing a disturbance," Derek insisted, his own voice actually the only raised one in the room. Instantly, the security man kicked David out of the bank. But before David left, something happened that changed everything. This story gives the best karma that happens when employees try to throw their own boss out of his bank. Have you ever been discriminated against anywhere? Share your experience in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, and hit the subscribe button now to see the moment these bank employees realize they've made the biggest mistake of their careers. David Gaston built an empire from nothing. The son of working-class parents who had been denied loans 7 times when trying to start their small business in the 1980s, David had promised himself things would be different when he had the power to make change. Now, as the founder and CEO of Meridian Financial, with over 200 branches nationwide, his name adorned buildings across the country. His face appeared in business magazines, and his story of rising from humble beginnings to banking magnate was taught in business schools. But on this ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a small convenience store in his old neighborhood of Westwood, David was just another customer, in casual clothes picking up a few items. No tailored suit, no security detail, no executive car waiting outside. Just a man in jeans, a face mask and a sweater, grabbing some essentials before heading home. As he reached for a carton of milk, a conversation from the next aisle cut through the store's quiet ambiance. "Even Meridian turned me down, and they claim to be community-focused," a deep voice said, frustration evident in every syllable. "I did everything right, everything they asked for." "It's always the same story," came another voice, heavy with familiar disappointment. "They find any excuse not to give us loans. My credit score is excellent, my business plan was solid, I have collateral, what more do they want?" David froze, his hand still holding the milk carton midair. His bank, the institution he had built from the ground up with a promise of equality, being discussed this way. He carefully placed the carton in his basket and moved closer, pretending to examine items on a nearby shelf. "I brought all my documentation," the first man continued. "Tax returns, business projections, everything." The loan officer at Meridian barely looked at it before saying I didn't qualify. Then I watched a white guy walk in after me and get approved for a similar amount in half the time. "Same thing happened to my cousin at their downtown branch," the second man added. "It's like they have a quota. We'll approve 1 black business owner this month, and that's our diversity quota filled." It's the same prejudice, just hidden behind fancy mission statements and diversity brochures. And the worst part is, it's owned by one of us, a black man. David's chest tightened. He peered around the corner and saw 2 well-dressed black men in their 30s, both with the weary expression of those who've hit the same wall too many times. "You know what's worse?" the taller man said, gesturing with a can of coffee. Meridian was supposed to be different. Their whole origin story is about serving underrepresented communities. Their founder, that Gaston guy, always talks about financial equality in his speeches. "All talk," his friend replied. "Just marketing to make white people feel good about where they bank. Same discrimination, fancier building." David quietly moved to another aisle, his appetite gone, his mind racing. Was this happening in his bank? Under his watch? The very institution he had created to solve this problem? 20 years earlier, David had stood in the empty building that would become Meridian Financial's first branch. He was younger, full of idealism, pointing at architectural plans while speaking passionately to a small group of investors. "This bank will be different," he had promised, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We'll serve everyone equally, regardless of race or background. My parents couldn't get a loan because of the color of their skin, not because of their finances, not because of their business plan, but because of who they were. Not in our bank. Never in our bank." The investors had nodded, captivated by his vision. One elderly gentleman had tearfully shared his own similar experience. Together, they had built what would become one of the fastest-growing financial institutions in the country. Banking for all wasn't just Meridian's slogan, it was supposed to be its DNA. Back in his executive office that evening, David stared at the framed mission statement mounted on his wall in elegant calligraphy: "Financial opportunity for all communities." The words now seemed to mock him. Reports and statistics covered his desk, loan approval rates that he'd never personally verified, customer satisfaction surveys that suddenly felt hollow, diversity initiatives that perhaps only went surface deep. "Sir, is everything all right?" his assistant asked from the doorway, concerned by the unusual silence from her normally energetic boss. "Cancel my meetings tomorrow." "All of them," he said finally. "Even the Federal Reserve Roundtable?" his assistant asked, alarmed. "Everything. I need to see this for myself," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The following morning found David in an unfamiliar apartment in the city, sitting in front of a professional makeup artist who specialized in theatrical transformations. Step by step, his appearance changed. Different glasses with thicker frames replaced his designer ones. Subtle facial hair, something he'd never worn in public, appeared along his jawline. The makeup artist worked meticulously to subtly alter the appearance of his cheekbones and add a few blemishes to his normally flawless complexion. Next came the clothes, items purchased from department stores that cost a fraction of his usual wardrobe. Gone was the hand-tailored suit and Italian leather shoes, replaced by khakis and a button-down shirt that didn't quite fit right. Most important was the posture. The confident CEO stance replaced by something more hesitant, less assured. David practiced in the mirror, rounding his shoulders slightly, making himself smaller in the way people often do when they lack power. "Remember," the makeup artist instructed as she applied the final touches, "don't make direct eye contact for too long. People who are used to being ignored tend to look away first." 4 hours later, the man who emerged from the apartment looked nothing like the David Gaston whose portrait hung in every Meridian financial branch nationwide. He had become just another customer, one about to experience his own bank from the other side of the counter. With a loan application in his hand containing the great financial qualifications but under a different name, David headed toward Meridian's flagship branch downtown. His heart pounded with anxiety, not about fooling his employees, but about what he might discover. The Meridian Financial flagship branch stood like a monument to success in the heart of the financial district. Gleaming glass, polished marble, and a massive logo, David adjusted his ill-fitting jacket one last time before entering the bank he had built. The disguise felt foreign on his skin, but the documentation in his briefcase was meticulously prepared. Same income level, good credit score, some business history and projections, just under a different name. David Williams was on paper identical to David Gaston in every financial qualification that mattered. The morning sun reflected off the bank's imposing glass facade as David paused momentarily on the sidewalk. He watched customers streaming in and out, men and women of all backgrounds entering with hope and leaving. Until today, he had never questioned what happened inside his branches beyond the statistics and quarterly reports, but the conversation he'd overheard in that convenience store had shattered his confidence in those numbers. As he pushed through the revolving door, just inside the entrance, David immediately noticed a well-dressed white man in his 40s being greeted near the welcome desk. Samantha, one of the senior customer service representatives who had been with the bank for years, was smiling broadly at him. David recognized her immediately, though she gave no indication of recognizing him. "Mr. Kensington, so wonderful to see you again," she exclaimed, extending her hand warmly. "How was your daughter's graduation? Harvard, wasn't it? You must be so proud." The man beamed, standing taller at the recognition. "Yes, political science, following in her old man's footsteps." "That's wonderful," Samantha replied with genuine enthusiasm. "And how's Martha? Has she recovered from her surgery?" "Good as new," Mr. Kensington nodded appreciatively. "Thank you for asking." Samantha's hand lightly touched his elbow in a gesture of personalized service as she guided him across the lobby. "Derek will take excellent care of you today. He's already pulled your information and is ready to discuss those investment options we talked about last time. He's set aside a full hour for you." "Fantastic," Mr. Kensington replied. "I've been looking forward to this meeting all week." David observed this interaction carefully, his trained eye noting every detail of the body language, the eye contact, the attentive posture, the prioritization. This was the Meridian experience he had always envisioned for every customer. This was the standard he had written into the company training manual himself. With Mr. Kensington escorted away, David approached the reception desk where another staff member, Alicia, was typing at her computer. David stood there for nearly 30 seconds before she looked up, her eyes meeting his only briefly before returning to her screen. "Can I help you?" she asked flatly, no trace of the warmth shown to Mr. Kensington moments earlier. No sir, no smile, no personalized greeting. "Yes, I have an appointment to discuss a business loan," David replied, using a voice slightly different from his normal authoritative tone. "The name is Williams, David Williams." Alicia glanced at her computer, scrolled briefly, then without looking back up at him, she reached below her desk and pulled out a clipboard stacked with forms. "Fill this out completely and bring it back," she said, sliding it across the counter. "Someone will be with you when they're available." No greeting by name. No guided tour to a loan officer's desk. No mention of when available might be. No eye contact. "I believe my appointment was for 10:30. David noted politely, glancing at his watch. It was 10:32. "We're running behind today," Alicia replied without looking up from her screen. "Have a seat and fill out the paperwork." David took a seat in the waiting area, the clipboard in his hand, and began filling out information he knew by heart, just with different personal details. From this vantage point, he had a clear view of the entire operation. A young black couple sat across from him, also waiting with completed paperwork in hand. David nodded politely to them, receiving tired smiles in return. The man checked his watch, a gesture that suggested they had been waiting for some time. The minutes ticked by. 10, 15, 20. Over this span, David observed a pattern so obvious it was painful to watch. 3 white customers entered after him. All 3 were greeted promptly, with variations of, "Good morning. How can we help you today?" All 3 were escorted to loan officers within minutes, despite arriving after David and the young couple. A white woman in her 30s entered, mentioned she didn't have an appointment, but wanted to discuss refinancing options, and was immediately paired with an available loan officer. "We can always make time for refinancing discussions," the receptionist assured her warmly. Meanwhile, David sat waiting, his completed paperwork ready, watching the minutes tick by on the large wall clock bearing the Meridian logo. Through the glass partition, Derek Thompson, one of the senior loan officers who had received a performance award just last month at a ceremony where David himself had given a speech, was enthusiastically showing the white businessman various options on his computer screen. Their body language told the story. Leaning in together, occasional laughter, a relationship being built. Derek's hand gestures were expansive, confident, the body language of someone making a sale, offering opportunity. David noticed subtle differences in how Derek interacted with Mr. Kensington compared to others. At one point, Derek and Mr. Kensington both looked at something on the computer screen, and Derek literally slapped the desk in excitement. That's exactly the kind of growth potential we love to see. His voice carried across the lobby. With your background, this approval is practically guaranteed. 25 minutes had now passed since David's arrival. The young black couple had been waiting even longer. David watched as another loan officer, Vivian Chen, finished with a client and became available. She walked to the reception desk, had a brief, whispered conversation with Alicia, then glanced toward the waiting area where David and the couple sat. Instead of calling either of them over, Vivian disappeared into the break room. 5 more minutes passed. David observed 3 loan officers chatting casually by the coffee machine, visible through the glass partition of the break room. None seemed in a hurry to return to work, despite the customers waiting. Have you ever wondered how differently you might be treated if the people serving you didn't know your status or position? Hit subscribe now to witness what happens when this powerful CEO experiences his own company's discrimination firsthand, and the earth-shattering consequences that follow. Finally, after 28 minutes of waiting, despite his appointment time having passed and multiple loan officers having been available, Alicia called his name. "Mr. Williams? Derek can see you now." The young couple exchanged a look of frustration. They had been waiting longer than David. He made note of their names on their paperwork as he passed. Johnson. Another detail to follow up on later. As David approached Derek's desk, he noticed the loan officer's demeanor shift instantly. The smile that had been so readily available for Mr. Kensington faded. The enthusiastic body language closed down. The chair that had been pulled out welcomingly for the previous client remained pushed against the desk. Derek didn't stand to greet him. Instead, he gestured vaguely toward the chair while finishing something on his computer, not bothering to make eye contact. "Have a seat," he said flatly. "Williams, is it?" "Yes, David Williams," David replied, extending his hand across the desk. After a moment's hesitation, just long enough to be noticeable, Derek shook it briefly before immediately reaching for the paperwork. No small talk. No welcome to Meridian. No how are you today. The contrast with Mr. Kensington's treatment couldn't have been more stark. As Derek began scanning the application, his eyebrows raised slightly at the financial figures, the very same figures that, under David Gaston's name, would have received VIP treatment. "You're applying for a business expansion loan of $100,000? Derek asked, skepticism evident in his tone. "That's correct," David replied calmly. "I've included my business plan, financial projections, and collateral documentation. As you can see, my current business has been profitable for 8 consecutive years." Derek barely glanced at the comprehensive business plan David had spent the previous evening preparing. Instead, he turned back to his computer and began typing rapidly. "Let's check your credit history first before we go any further," he said dismissively. "No point wasting time if there are any issues." In those first moments, before a single substantive word about finances had been exchanged, the verdict had already been rendered. David could see it in Derek's eyes, in the subtle shift of his shoulders, in the way his fingers didn't extend for a handshake until David initiated one, in the assumptions already made. This was a different Meridian Financial than the one experienced by Mr. Kensington. This was a different world entirely. Through the glass walls of Derek's office, David could see the young black couple still waiting. A white man who had entered the bank after David was now being enthusiastically greeted by Vivian, who had apparently finished her coffee break at precisely the right moment. What David didn't know yet was just how dramatically different his treatment would become when he actually began discussing his loan application with Derek, and how quickly this routine loan meeting would escalate into one of the most shocking confrontations in banking history. Throughout the bank, security cameras silently recorded everything, cameras that would later provide irrefutable evidence of what was about to unfold. In David's tie, a tiny recording device captured every word, every dismissive tone, every microaggression that was becoming increasingly macroaggressive. The stage was set. The players were in position, and the man they all failed to recognize was about to experience firsthand exactly why those customers in the convenience store had lost faith in his institution. Derek Thompson's office was a shrine to success. "So, Mr. Williams," Derek began, barely glancing up from his phone as he continued typing something. "Give me a moment here." The dismissive tone was immediate. No urgency, no acknowledgement that David had been kept waiting nearly 30 minutes. Derek's attention remained fixed on his device for another 45 seconds, an eternity in professional interaction. David sat patiently, observing every detail, mentally recording the stark contrast to how Mr. Kensington had been treated earlier. Finally, Derek set his phone down, though not completely away, and glanced at the paperwork. "Business expansion loan, $100,000, he read aloud, skepticism dripping from each syllable. "That's ambitious." David leaned forward slightly, opening his meticulously prepared business portfolio. "I've been running Williams Consulting for 8 years now. We specialize in supply chain optimization for mid-sized manufacturers. The loan would fund our expansion into 3 new markets where we've already secured preliminary contracts." The portfolio contained everything a loan officer could possibly want. Immaculate financial statements, a business plan that had been reviewed by actual Meridian executives in its preparation, though they didn't know it, market analysis, secured contracts, and perfect credit documentation. It was, by any objective standard, a loan application that should have been fast-tracked for approval. Derek gave it a cursory glance, flipping pages rapidly without reading them. His eyes never lingered on the impressive profit margins, the growth trajectory, or the significant collateral offered. "Consulting, huh?" Derek said, setting the portfolio aside much too quickly. "And where did you say you got your business experience?" The question hung in the air. The first of many designed not to gather information, but to undermine. David had included his MBA credentials and 15 years of industry experience in the very first page of the portfolio. "As noted in my business overview, I have an MBA from Northwestern and 15 years of experience in the industry, including executive positions at 2 Fortune 500 companies," David replied calmly. Derek's eyebrow raised slightly. "Northwestern? Interesting choice." The implication was clear: doubt about the credential itself. "Yes, full scholarship," David added, watching Derek's microexpressions carefully. At this point, Vivian Chen, who had been silently observing from her chair to the side, leaned forward. "Mr. Williams, while Derek reviews your information, perhaps I could show you some of our other loan products. We have several options that might be more appropriate for your situation." "I'd be interested to hear what makes them more appropriate than what I've applied for," David replied, maintaining his composure. Vivian pulled out a glossy brochure for Meridian's Community Business Builder loan program, a product with interest rates 3.5% higher than standard business loans, shorter repayment terms, and more restrictive conditions. "This program is specially designed for entrepreneurs from diverse backgrounds," she explained, emphasizing certain words in a way that made their meaning clear. "The qualification requirements are more flexible." The irony was painful. David never knew this part was a way to steer minority applicants toward less favorable terms. He'd been assured it would never be used that way. "I believe my qualifications exceed the requirements for your standard business expansion loan." David noted. Why would I choose a product with higher interest rates and more restrictive terms? Derek cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the conversation. Mr. Williams, banking is complex. People from your background often don't understand financial responsibility the same way established business owners do. These specialized products provide guardrails while you build credit worthiness. The statement hung in the air, naked discrimination thinly veiled as advice. David felt his pulse quicken, but maintained his calm exterior. My credit score is 815, David replied evenly. I've never missed a payment on any obligation. My business has been profitable every quarter since inception. What exactly about my background suggests I don't understand financial responsibility? Derek shifted uncomfortably. I'm speaking generally, of course, but realistic expectations are important. A loan of this size, well, it's substantial. By the way, that's a nice suit. Custom made? The abrupt change of subject was jarring, a deliberate attempt to imply something improper about how David could afford even the modest suit he wore. Department store, actually, David replied. I believe in living below my means to reinvest in my business. As the financial statements show, I take a modest salary despite significant company profits. Derek nodded condescendingly. That's admirable. But let me be direct with you, Mr. Williams. Loans like this require extensive scrutiny. The approval committee will want to know why you need such a large amount and whether you truly understand the obligation you're taking on. The business plan details exactly how every dollar will be allocated, David replied, pulling out specific pages from the portfolio. As you can see, we've secured contracts that will generate an estimated $1.2 million in new revenue within 18 months, more than covering the loan repayment schedule. Derek barely glanced at the documents. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, a power pose David recognized from negotiation seminars. Let's be honest, Mr. Williams, Derek said, his voice taking on a different tone. Someone like you is statistically a flight risk on a loan of this magnitude. The bank has to protect its interests. The room fell silent. The statement hung in the air like a noxious gas. David felt a genuine surge of anger, but channeled it into his next question. His voice deliberately measured. I'm curious, Mr. Thompson, David said slowly. What exactly do you mean by someone like me? The question was direct, unavoidable, and put Derek in the uncomfortable position of having to explain his bias explicitly or backpedal. His eyes flicked nervously to the side, seeking help from Vivian, who suddenly became very interested in adjusting her notepad. I'm referring to credit demographics, Derek replied unconvincingly. Statistical risk categories. Nothing personal. I see, David said. And which demographic factors are influencing your assessment of my application? My perfect credit score, my 8 years of business success, my secured contracts, my significant collateral, or is there another factor you're considering? Derek's discomfort was now visible. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, bought time by taking a sip of water. Mr. Williams, you're misunderstanding me. We have a responsibility to our depositors to evaluate risk appropriately. Your application will be given the same consideration as any other. The lie was so transparent, it was almost laughable. David had watched with his own eyes as Derek had enthusiastically all but pre-approved Mr. Kensington for a similar amount based on far less documentation. So you're saying the fact that I'm black has no bearing on your skepticism? David asked directly. The question landed like a bomb in the carefully maintained pretense of the interaction. Derek's face flushed red, his mouth opening and closing without words emerging. We don't. Derek stammered. Race is absolutely not a factor in our lending decisions. That would be illegal and against Meridian's policies. David nodded slowly. I'm relieved to hear that. Then let's return to my application and discuss the specific business merits, shall we? What Derek didn't realize in that moment was that David wasn't just testing him. He was giving him a chance at redemption. A chance to correct the course, to do his job properly, to treat this applicant with the same respect and consideration given to others. The atmosphere in Derek Thompson's office had shifted. What began as subtle discrimination had crystallized into something harder, more tangible. David's direct question about racial bias had clearly unsettled Derek, who was now attempting to regain control of the interaction. "Let's continue reviewing your application, Mr. Williams," Derek said stiffly, pulling the folder closer. "You mentioned supply chain optimization for manufacturers. That's a competitive sector. What specific value does your company offer that established firms don't?" It was a legitimate business question, the first one Derek had asked, but the tone suggested he was looking for flaws rather than understanding. David was prepared. "We specialize in mid-market companies that are typically overlooked by the larger consulting firms," David explained, turning to page 17 of his business plan. David's command of the material was absolute, not surprising, since he regularly reviewed hundreds of business plans in his actual role as CEO. The technical details he shared about supply chain optimization were expert level, reflecting knowledge that would impress any genuine financial professional. Derek's expression tightened. He hadn't expected this level of expertise. His eyes darted to specific figures on the pages David referenced, searching for weaknesses and finding none. "These projected returns seem optimistic," Derek said, though the documented past performance clearly supported the projections. Through the glass walls of Derek's office, David noticed a middle-aged white couple being escorted to another loan officer's desk. The contrast in treatment was immediately apparent. Smiles, handshakes, coffee offered, chairs pulled out. The loan officer was leaning forward attentively, nodding enthusiastically as they spoke. Derek noticed David's attention had shifted and followed his gaze. Something in Derek's demeanor hardened further. "If you'd like to apply for a smaller loan amount, perhaps we could expedite the process," Derek suggested, changing tactics. "Maybe $10,000 to start? That would be more realistic for a first-time applicant." "I'm not a first-time applicant," David corrected him calmly. "As my documentation shows, I've successfully managed business credit lines of up to $500,000 with perfect repayment history. The $100,000 I'm requesting is actually conservative relative to our projected expansion needs." Derek's irritation became increasingly visible. His client wasn't fitting the narrative he had constructed, wasn't showing the deference or lack of financial sophistication he had expected. Every time Derek attempted to undermine the application, David responded with precise, knowledgeable answers that should have strengthened his case. Vivian, who had been largely silent, leaned over and whispered something to Derek. Though it was meant to be private, David's acute hearing, developed from years of boardroom negotiations, caught every word. "We're backed up in the queue. Harrison needs help with the Wilsons' jumbo mortgage." Derek nodded subtly, then glanced at his watch with exaggerated concern. "Mr. Williams, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I think we've covered enough for today. I'll need to submit this for review by our committee, which typically takes 7 to 10 business days." "That's interesting," David replied. "I noticed Mr. Kensington earlier was told his approval was practically guaranteed during his initial consultation. Is there a different review process for certain clients?" The pointed observation landed like a slap. Derek's face flushed slightly. "Every situation is different," he said dismissively. "Mr. Kensington has a long-standing relationship with our bank." "I see," David nodded. "And how does one establish such a relationship if loan applications are treated differently from the start?" Derek's patience was clearly wearing thin. He shuffled papers unnecessarily, a delaying tactic David had seen countless times in negotiations. "Look," Derek said in a lower voice to Vivian, not realizing David could hear perfectly. We're wasting time on this lowlife when we have real clients waiting. He looks like a fraud. The slur hung in the air for a moment. David felt a genuine surge of anger, but maintained his composed exterior, though he allowed just enough reaction to show that he had heard the comment. "I'd like to speak with your manager, please," David said, his voice calm but firm. Derek's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected to be overheard. His embarrassment quickly transformed into defensiveness. "The branch manager doesn't have time for people who can't qualify for basic loans?" he replied coldly. "I've told you what the process is. If you're not satisfied with that, perhaps another bank would be a better fit for your situation." The dismissal was blatant now, not even thinly veiled. David remained seated, his posture relaxed but dignified. "I believe I have the right to speak with a manager about my application and about your conduct during this meeting," David stated. "I'll wait here until they're available." Derek's composure cracked further. "Mr. Williams, I've been more than patient. If you're going to be difficult, I'll have to ask you to leave." "Requesting to speak with a manager is a standard customer right," David replied evenly. "There's nothing difficult about that request." Derek stood abruptly, his chair rolling backward from the force. "I'm not going to argue with you. This meeting is over." David remained seated. "I'll wait for the manager, thank you." Derek's face reddened further. "Security," he called out, loud enough to be heard through the glass partition. A security guard, a young man named Thomas according to his name badge, approached the door of the office, hand instinctively moving to the radio on his belt. "Is there a problem, Mr. Thompson?" Thomas asked, looking between the two men with confusion. David was sitting calmly, hands folded on his lap, while Derek was standing, visibly agitated. "Mr. Williams is being confrontational and refusing to leave after his appointment has concluded," Derek explained, his description bearing no resemblance to the reality visible to anyone watching. "Please escort him out of the building." Thomas hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the mismatch between Derek's claim and what he was seeing. "Sir," Thomas addressed David, "I'll need to ask you to come with me. I've simply requested to speak with a manager about my loan application," David explained to Thomas calmly. "I have not raised my voice or been confrontational in any way." "He's causing a disturbance," Derek insisted, his own voice actually the only raised one in the room. "He's been argumentative throughout the entire meeting." Thomas still seemed uncertain, but years of conditioning to follow orders from bank management won out over his evident discomfort with the situation. "Sir, I need you to come with me now," Thomas said to David, his hand still on his radio. "Please don't make this difficult." David stood slowly, gathering his documents with deliberate care. "I understand you're doing your job, Thomas. I'll go with you, but I want to be clear that I'm being removed for requesting to speak with a manager after experiencing discriminatory treatment." "Don't listen to him," Derek cut in. "He's just angry his loan didn't qualify. We see this all the time." Other customers in the bank had begun to notice the situation unfolding. Some looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with undisguised interest. The young black couple David had noticed earlier exchanged knowing glances. As Thomas began escorting David toward the exit, they passed the loan officer helping the white couple. Their conversation was easily audible. "With your qualifications, we could actually approve up to $200,000 if you'd like to consider a larger renovation budget," the loan officer was saying enthusiastically. "The rates are excellent right now." The irony of the moment was almost too perfect, as if staged to underscore everything that had just transpired in Derek's office. Same bank, same day, dramatically different treatment. What Derek Thompson didn't know, couldn't have imagined in his worst nightmare, was that his career at Meridian Financial was now measured in minutes, not years. The man being escorted out by security was about to reveal himself as the founder and CEO of the entire organization, and the security cameras silently recording throughout the bank had captured every moment of the interaction. The walk of shame through the Meridian financial lobby felt endless. David Gaston, disguised as David Williams, was being escorted out of his own bank by security, past curious customers and uncomfortable employees. For many watching, it was an all too familiar scene. Another black loan applicant shown the door. For David, it was the culmination of a devastating experiment that had confirmed his worst fears. Thomas, the young security guard, maintained a respectful distance as they walked, clearly uncomfortable with his assignment. "I'm sorry about this, sir," he whispered, almost inaudibly. "I'm just doing what I'm told." David nodded slightly in acknowledgement. He understood the young man's position all too well. As they neared the grand entrance doors, David reached into his pocket and removed his cell phone. "I need to make a quick call before I leave," he said calmly to Thomas. "It will only take a moment." Thomas hesitated, glancing back toward Derek's office, where the loan officer was watching intently, clearly expecting David to be removed immediately. "Sir, I've been instructed to escort you outside," Thomas replied uncertainly. "1 minute," David said, his tone shifting subtly, a hint of the authority he typically wielded emerging through his disguise. "That's all I need." Something in David's demeanor made Thomas pause. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence, so at odds with the difficult customer Derek had described. Perhaps it was his own discomfort with the situation. Whatever the reason, Thomas nodded slightly. 1 minute, he agreed. David dialed a number from memory. Not a number in his contact list, but one he knew by heart. A direct line to the executive floor of Meridian Financial Headquarters, located just 20 floors above this very branch. Across town at Meridian's executive offices, Eleanor Matthews, executive vice president and David's most trusted lieutenant for 15 years, was reviewing quarterly reports when her private line rang. Only 5 people in the entire organization had this number. She answered immediately. "Eleanor Matthews," she said crisply. "Eleanor, it's David," came the voice on the other end. "I'm downstairs in the main branch. I need you here. Now." There was no explanation, no context, but none was needed. In 15 years, David had never made such a request without good reason. "On my way," she replied without hesitation, already standing and grabbing her badge. David ended the call and turned to Thomas. "Thank you for your patience. I believe things are about to change." Thomas looked confused, but remained respectfully silent. From across the lobby, Derek was now approaching with long, angry strides, clearly unhappy that his instructions weren't being followed to the letter. "I thought I was clear," Derek snapped at Thomas. "Remove this man from the premises immediately." Before Thomas could respond, David reached up and began to peel away the subtle facial hair that had been applied that morning. The adhesive came away cleanly, revealing the familiar jawline that appeared in Meridian's annual reports and marketing materials. Next came the glasses, removed and tucked into his pocket. David stood straighter, his posture shifting from the slightly hunched stance he'd adopted as part of his disguise to the commanding presence that his employees knew well. Derek's irritation turned to confusion as he watched this transformation begin. Around the lobby, other employees had started to notice something unusual happening near the entrance. The busy hum of banking activity began to quiet as more eyes turned toward the scene unfolding. "What do you think you're doing?" Derek demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. David didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his inner pocket and removed his actual identification badge, the executive-level clearance with the distinctive gold border that granted access to every part of Meridian Financial's global operations. He held it in his hand, but didn't yet display it. The main entrance doors burst open. Eleanor Matthews, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, strode in with the purposeful walk that had earned her the nickname the Hurricane among Meridian staff. Her face was a mask of controlled intensity as she scanned the lobby, quickly locating David. "Stop everything right now," she commanded, her voice carrying across the now hushed space. The authority in her tone was unmistakable. Every head turned. Every conversation halted. Even Derek took an instinctive step backward. Eleanor's gaze swept the lobby before settling on Derek with laser-like intensity. "Mr. Thompson, I presume?" Derek nodded mutely, confusion evident on his face. He clearly recognized the executive vice president, but couldn't understand why she was addressing him directly, or how she knew his name without introduction. Eleanor turned to the gathered crowd of employees and customers, her voice projecting clearly throughout the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? I need to make something absolutely clear to everyone in this branch. This man," she gestured toward David, "is David Gaston, the founder and CEO of Meridian Financial." The words landed like a thunderclap in the silent lobby. Gasps echoed from every corner. A customer dropped a coffee cup, the spill spreading unnoticed across the marble floor. The young black couple David had noticed earlier exchanged shocked glances. Derek Thompson's face drained of color so rapidly it was as if someone had opened a valve. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself on dry land. Beside him, Vivian, who had emerged from the office to see what was happening, grabbed the nearest desk for support as her knees visibly weakened. That's not possible," Derek finally managed to stammer. "Mr. Gaston is standing right in front of you," Eleanor finished for him. "The man you just called a lowlife. The man you refused to give a fair hearing to. The man you had a security escort out of his own bank." David stepped forward, the transformation now complete. Without the disguise elements, with his natural posture and commanding presence restored, he was instantly recognizable as the man whose portrait hung in the lobby. He gestured toward the lapel of his jacket, where a small, nearly invisible camera was discreetly pinned. "This entire interaction has been recorded," David stated calmly. "Along with the bank's own security footage, we now have comprehensive documentation of what transpired here today." The branch had fallen into absolute silence. The kind of silence that has weight and substance. Customers stood frozen, witnessing a scene none of them would ever forget. Employees looked at each other in growing horror as the implications became clear. Derek's face had now progressed from white to a sickly gray. Recognition dawned in his eyes as he finally saw through the minimal disguise. "Mr. Gaston, there's been a terrible misunderstanding," he began, his voice quavering. "If I had known it was you—" "That's precisely the point, Mr. Thompson," David interrupted, his voice icy. "You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat a loan applicant with dignity and fairness. The fact that you would have behaved differently if you knew my identity only confirms what happened here today." Eleanor stepped forward, her expression a combination of professional control and barely contained fury. "Mr. Gaston has been receiving complaints about this branch for months," she announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Allegations of discriminatory lending practices, differential treatment based on race, steering qualified minority applicants toward unfavorable loan products." Today, he decided to see it firsthand. David surveyed the lobby, making eye contact with various employees before addressing the entire room. "I founded this bank 20 years ago because my parents were denied loans based on their skin color," he said, his voice resonating with controlled emotion. "Nothing has changed. The very discrimination I built this institution to fight against has infected it from within." He walked slowly toward the center of the lobby, the badge now displayed prominently in his hand. "Every customer deserves the same respect, the same consideration, and the same fair evaluation of their qualifications. Regardless of their race, regardless of how they dress, and regardless of whether they're the CEO. David turned to face Derek and Vivian directly, his expression resolute. Discrimination has no place in banking, it has no place in America, and it certainly has no place in my bank. Eleanor stepped forward, pointing directly at Derek and Vivian. You have 7 minutes to collect your belongings, she stated coldly. All of you who participated in this disgraceful episode. Security will escort you to clear out your desks and surrender your credentials. Thomas, the security guard who moments ago had been escorting David out, now stood at attention, awaiting instructions from his actual boss. Thomas, David addressed him directly. Please ensure that Mr. Thompson and Miss Chen are escorted from the building after they collect their personal items. They are no longer employees of Meridian Financial. The young guard nodded, his expression a mixture of shock and newfound resolve. As Derek and Vivian stood paralyzed by the sudden catastrophic turn of events, David turned his attention to the young black couple still waiting in the lobby. With the dignified stride that had carried him through countless boardrooms, he approached them directly. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, I believe? I understand you've been waiting to discuss a loan application. I'd be honored to review it with you personally. History was being made at that moment, not just for Meridian Financial, but for the Johnsons, for everyone witnessing this extraordinary scene, and for the banking industry that would soon feel the reverberations of what had transpired here today. The 7-minute countdown to Derek and Vivian's final exit had begun. But the countdown to a fundamental transformation of Meridian Financial, and perhaps banking itself, was just getting started. The main conference room of Meridian Financial's flagship branch had never been filled to capacity before today. Employees stood along the walls, packed tightly together, an atmosphere of stunned silence enveloping the space. Just 40 minutes earlier, they had witnessed something unprecedented in the bank's history. Their CEO, in disguise, experiencing and exposing discrimination within his own institution. Now, every employee from the branch, from tellers to loan officers, from maintenance staff to managers, gathered as David Gaston stood at the head of the conference table. The disguise was completely gone now, his authoritative presence unmistakable. Behind him, a large screen displayed the Meridian Financial logo alongside the company's founding mission statement, Financial Opportunity for All Communities. I want to thank you all for assembling on such short notice, David began, his voice grave but measured. What happened today represents a profound failure, not just of individuals but of our culture, our training, and our values as an institution. Eleanor Matthews stood beside him, a laptop open in front of her. With a few keystrokes, the screen behind them changed to display footage from David's hidden camera. Before we discuss next steps, I believe it's essential that everyone understand exactly what transpired today, David continued. This footage will be difficult to watch. It should be difficult to watch, but we cannot address what we do not acknowledge. For the next several minutes, the room watched in uncomfortable silence as Derek Thompson's treatment of David Williams played out in high definition. The dismissive body language, the condescending tone, the blatant steering toward inferior loan products, the low-life comment that had sealed his fate. Interspersed with this footage were split-screen comparisons showing how white customers had been treated during the same time period. The stark contrast undeniable and damning. Several employees looked away in shame. Others appeared shocked, genuinely unaware of the differential treatment happening around them every day. When the video ended, David allowed the silence to linger for a moment before speaking. This is not an isolated incident, he stated firmly. We've received 17 formal complaints about discriminatory practices at this branch in the past year alone. I've spent the morning reviewing denied loan applications from the past 6 months. The pattern is unmistakable and indefensible. Eleanor stepped forward, her expression resolute. "As of this moment, Derek Thompson and Vivian Chen have been terminated for cause," she announced. Additionally, James Harrington, the security supervisor who established the protocol allowing customers to be removed for simply requesting to speak with management, has also been terminated. Murmurs rippled through the assembled staff. Eleanor raised a hand, silencing them. "Let me be absolutely clear," she continued. "This is not the end of our response. It is merely the beginning." David moved from behind the table, walking slowly among his employees as he spoke. He paused beside a young teller who had been visibly affected by the video footage. "I built Meridian Financial to be different," David continued. "To be better. Today I learned that we have failed that mission. The discrimination my parents faced decades ago is still happening, right here, within these walls, bearing our name." He returned to the front of the room, his expression shifting from disappointment to determination. "Starting tomorrow, we are implementing comprehensive changes across all Meridian branches, beginning with this one. Every employee will undergo enhanced fair lending training, not the standardized compliance videos you're used to, but intensive, real-world scenarios with professional facilitators." Eleanor advanced to the next slide, displaying details of the new initiatives. "We're also launching a mystery shopper program," David explained. "Individuals of different racial backgrounds, with identical financial qualifications, will apply for loans at every Meridian branch nationwide. The results will be published internally and reviewed by our newly established Lending Equity Committee. Before this day ends, I will personally review every loan application that has been denied at this branch in the past 3 months. Those that meet our actual qualification standards will be approved immediately, with apology calls from me directly." Derek informed his employees. Eleanor advanced to the final slide. A quote from the original Meridian Financial founding document: "Banking must be an equalizer, not a divider. Capital must flow based on merit, not privilege." "These aren't just words," David said, pointing to the screen. "This is our purpose, our reason for existing. And starting today, we will live up to it, or we will fail trying." He surveyed the room, making eye contact with as many employees as possible. The meeting concluded with the distribution of new compliance materials and the announcement of next steps. As the staff filed out, visibly shaken by the day's events, David and Eleanor remained to answer individual questions and concerns. Later that evening, with the sun setting over the city skyline, David's car pulled up outside the small convenience store in Westwood, where this journey had begun just 24 hours earlier. By remarkable coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence at all, in a neighborhood with limited banking options, the same 2 men whose conversation had sparked David's undercover operation were there, discussing their financial challenges over coffee in the small seating area. David approached them directly, extending his hand in greeting. "Excuse me, gentlemen. My name is David Gaston. I'm the CEO of Meridian Financial. I overheard your conversation here yesterday about difficulties getting loans approved. I'd like to personally review your applications, if you'd be willing." Their initial shock and suspicion gradually gave way to cautious optimism as David explained what had transpired, omitting names but sharing the broader revelation of his undercover experience. By the time they parted ways an hour later, both men had appointments at Meridian's executive offices the following morning. For David Gaston, the journey that began with an overheard conversation had transformed into a mission to reclaim not just his bank's purpose, but the very premise of fair lending in America. The disguise was gone, but the clarity it had provided would remain, informing every policy, every hire, every loan decision going forward. If you enjoyed this story, hit the subscribe button and share to others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.